I see Taylor Marshall and Kendi Hall have come out talking about this story from Kansas, the Kansas bishop who has, acknowledged the fact that some priests, a couple of parishes, were using wine that was polluted with other substances, blueberry juice and preservatives and such. So it rendering the mass invalid because the form wine from grapes, pure wine from grapes, had not been used. In order for the mass to be valid, you need to have form and matter. The mass has to be said. The words of consecration, which are the same in the new mass as the old mass. In case anyone is in the old mass it said hoc est enim corpus meum quod pro vobis tradetur. In the new mass, the priest says, if he chooses to use Latin, he will use the same words, hoc est enim corpus meum quod pro vobis tradetur. So the form and the matter have to be the same. You cannot change the form and the matter in the mass. Otherwise, you render the mass invalid. And so when a priest in Ireland during the consecration profanes the mass and saying, and we hold up the cup like the McCarthy cup or something like that, he's actually rendering that mass invalid. It's not a valid consecration. It's very important that if we're going to offer the sacrifice, if a priest is going to offer the sacrifice of the mass, he does as the church stipulates. You say the black and do the red. You use bread made from wheat, and you use wine made from grapes that has no preservatives, no additives, no blueberry juice, nothing like this. And the bread that's made from wheat is, there are some parishes around Ireland that will offer a low gluten bread. And I just wanted to clarify this because as a celiac myself, cannot eat gluten and would struggle with it. I'm not that kind of, militant anti gluten-free person, but I would struggle. And this is a common thing in Ireland. The host that is being used in the mass that's low gluten is made from wheat. It has the gluten reduced, and so it actually has a tiny particle. It has a tiny piece of real bread, full real bread with gluten in it. It's not gluten-free host. It's a low gluten host. And some priests, I know some priests that have a gluten intolerance, and instead of using the gluten-free host, the low gluten host, most of the priests, what I'm seeing is they're just taking a smaller piece of the host. So they just break it down, take a small piece of the host, which has the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ. So you're not rendering the mass invalid by just taking a small piece. And this is really important, this whole debate, because the particles of the Eucharist are sacred. The particles of the Eucharist are sacred. This is why traditional practices in the church always protected the sacredness of the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ. We had a pattern. The church could learn so much from the traditional Latin Mass movement, so much on how we respect the Eucharist and how we prepare for Mass. This is kind of key. If the church can't face its traditions and learn from them and bring them along, it will lose something incredibly precious. And the traditional Latin Mass, the beautiful, ancient traditional Latin Mass has so much to offer the Catholic Church. And it's important that when we prepare for Mass, we use sacred vessels. We have a sacred consecrated altar, a church where we hold silence and we prepare ourselves for this, the sacrifice of the Mass. We're using proper wine that's been made for the, oftentimes it's Mass wine or vino da missa. You'll see it on the bottle, Mass wine. And it'll be wine that's made usually in monasteries or someplace like this, or a specific vineyard that caters for the requirements of Catholic Church. It's a wine made from grapes that has no sulfates and no additives. It's organic. It's just made for the specific requirements for Mass. And bread usually made by nuns in monasteries, Carmelite nuns. It's bread made for, it's bread with gluten, normal, made from wheat with no additives, no preservatives, nothing added. It's just bread made from wheat, unleavened bread in the Catholic Roman Rite. In the Eastern Rite, in the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Greek Catholic Church, in the East, they will use leavened bread, and the Church has declared that you can use both. So unleavened in the West, in the Roman Rite, that's what we've used as our tradition. In the East, they used leavened bread, like a loaf of bread, and both are acceptable. It's just bread made from wheat. End of story. And if you're a celiac, you will receive a low gluten host, which will have a tiny particle of gluten containing wheat bread in it. And that's, it's really important. The host isn't a different substance. It's bread made from wheat. Now, the Bishop of Kansas has come out, decrying the fact that invalid masses were being offered in some places because they were using wine that contained other substances, that contained preservatives, that contained blueberry juice, and God knows what. How this happened, we don't know. But when you're highlighting this tragedy in the church, you don't go undermining the whole church and saying, oh, look what happened in Kansas. So how can we trust that the Novus Ordo is valid? How can we trust that the Mass we're going to is valid? As somebody, that prepared wine for Mass for years in the seminary, I only ever remember the Legionaries of Christ using Mass wine. It said it on the bottle, Mass wine. It has a specific taste. It's kind of this slightly sweet wine, not the type that you would be, the 12 to 14% wine that you would have in a shop. It's kind of slightly it's like the natural fermentation that you would get without adding sugar. Because a lot of the times these high alcohol wines, I make wine. I have a vineyard here in my back of the house, so I make wine. And so in order to boost up the alcohol level, you have to add sugar. And this is what sometimes happens in the winemaking process. In order to get a consistent alcohol level, you're adding sugar in, or you're adding something else to bring up the alcohol level. But when you're making wine for Mass, there's no sugar added. You can't add. It's fermented in a certain way. It's just from grapes. There's no sulfates used. There's no blueberry juice used. And I think, in my experience of seeing wine being used at Masses around the world, even in the Vatican, it tends to be the same type of wine. Kind of color, the colors vary, but it's this it tends to be the same type of wine. And it's not rocket science. The church is pretty clear on the type of wine that needs to be used. It can be from red or white grapes, and it's fermented naturally from those grapes without using, adding different yeasts, without adding sugar, without adding other substances in or fruits in. It's wine made from red or white grapes, fermented naturally. The church doesn't stipulate exactly how much alcohol it needs to have in it, but usually it's the fermented wine from grapes. Now, when you see these issues occurring in the church, so in the States they've had the improper baptisms where the wrong words were used. We've had now some Masses where the wrong wine is used, sadly. You don't go throwing or casting doubt into the church. As podcasters, Kennedy Hall and Taylor Marshall have, how can we trust the Novus Ordo? Look what's happened in the Novus Ordo. I mean, in all due respect, Taylor Marshall you know, you haven't been in a Catholic seminary. He hasn't been in a Catholic seminary for 9 years. You know, when I was a seminarian, we worked all over the church in Italy, in Switzerland, in France, in Poland, in Spain, in Mexico, United States, Ireland, UK, Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic. These are all places where I worked and where I attended Mass in ordinary parishes all over the place, serving Mass in all these places, preparing wine for Mass. And I remember going to many sacristies and taking out Mass wine from the shelf, and it usually, as far as I remember, always said Mass wine, or some type of labeling on the bottle to say this wine is made for Mass. You know, that's generally speaking, you know, de Moulier or something like this. There, to be specific, it often seemed the same vineyards, but it usually always said Mass wine, or some Vino de Missa, or Vino de la Mcha, or something like that. You would see it on the bottle. It would be distinctive. It wouldn't be any of the brands you would ever see in a supermarket. It just wouldn't be. So, you know, I'm just relaying my own experience. How can you trust that, you know, how can you have faith in the new order of the Mass when you see abuses? When you have to inform yourself on what our faith teaches, you know, and what our faith teaches. And most priests will just, when it comes to the Mass, they don't get into complicated. Most priests, the majority of priests that say the new Mass, don't complicate things by using the wrong bread or the wrong wine. You know, they simply don't. It's just not rocket. It's just rocket science. You go and get your hosts from a proper ecclesiastical supplier, usually a convent, and you get proper hosts. You don't go on eBay and you buy them somewhere. You know, you get them from a proper supplier, and you get your wine from the proper supplier. And a bottle of wine for Mass will last a long time, because at most Roman Catholic Masses, we don't give the chalice to the faithful the majority of the time, because, you know, in the Latin Rite, our Lord is present, body and blood, soul and divinity, in the host. And I think it's very important that as bloggers, you don't go undermining faith in our institutions, in our bishops. Yes, you challenge them, you highlight the problems. Now, if I saw, you know, I have blogged about problems, but you don't go undermining the faith in the church, because, you know, you tackle abuses, and you tackle them and talk about them. I mean, I think, sadly, you know, Taylor Marshall and Kennedy Hall, you might be deflecting from the issue. You know, Kennedy hasn't spoken about this, and he has written a book about Archbishop Lefebvre, and I admire Kennedy Hall. I think he is one of the best bloggers that I've seen. I think any bishop would be proud to have a man with his faith and his love for the church, because he's simply on fire for the Lord. But you don't undermine the church by casting doubt in the sacraments for an abuse in one diocese in America, to say, how can you trust the Novus Ordo and the whole church? Guys, honestly, that's not the way we work as Catholic bloggers. We have to build up the faith. We have to inspire the church, inspire Catholics. You know, there's so much. I mean, in Ireland, there's so much beauty happening in the church. There's so much vitality. And I know the negativity can be there, but our Lord hasn't abandoned the church. And there are some incredible priests that use the proper wine and use proper hosts, you know, wine made from grapes, and, you know, bread made from wheat. You know, even though I struggle with the whole celiac side, I usually just receive the normal host, and it tends not to cause me too many problems. And I don't, you know, I usually tend to receive the normal host. I know some places they offer a low gluten host, but I would just tend to receive the normal wheat gluten host. but that's the only type of gluten I eat. I don't drink beers or anything like this. Uh, and I'm just want to give encouragement to Catholics to, when you're seeing these stories coming out in the media, don't see this as representative of what happens behind closed doors in a sacristy when they're preparing wine for mass, that somebody's gone out to a supermarket and picked up the cheapest version. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. I was just watching a priest yesterday preparing for mass, and I saw him. He was finishing off the bottle of ecclesiastical wine mass, and you could clearly see that, because he was preparing wine for he was preparing the wine for mass yesterday, and you could clearly see that the bottle he was using was mass wine, clearly identifiable. And coincidentally, we all received communion with both species, and the wine, the blood of our Lord that we received, is the typical mass wine that I've always experienced in the church. And our Lord is present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. And so many priests take a lot of care ensuring that the form and the matter that is used in the mass is right. So many priests in the new mass will be very, very careful on the form and the matter that's approved by the church. The mass is valid if it's said in the vernacular. When Cyril and Methodius wanted to evangelize the Slavs, the church allowed them to use their language to evangelize, to have a liturgy in their language. And it was valid 1,000 years ago. So we shouldn't cast out, obviously we it's sad what we've done to the liturgy, and you could pull up all the abuses and the clown masses and stuff like this, but our Lord is present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, in the Eucharist, in the new mass, with form and matter properly used. When a priest says hoc est enim corpus meum quod pro vobis tradetur, and he uses bread made from wheat, and he's a validly ordained priest, from a canonical bishop that has apostolic succession, our Lord is present there in that mass, and we shouldn't cast doubt. We shouldn't be saying to Catholics, "Oh, how can you trust the Novus Order," when the Archbishop of Kansas has admitted the failings in his diocese. That's not the representative reality of the Catholic Church. And we owe faithful that listen to our blogs the truth, so we don't cast doubt into them. Oh, I'm not being fed the Eucharist in the new mass. Oh, I better head over. I better travel 2 or 3 hours to a traditional Latin mass where I can be sure that I'm going to find the Eucharist. And guys, that's atrocious. That's terrible to cast out into the lives of lay Catholics if we're blogging about the Eucharist. So, I just wanted to give this encouragement to, and again, I love the traditional Latin Mass. I love the reverence. I love how the paten is used. I love how the Eucharist is respected. It is the highest form of prayer in the church. It is deeply mystical. It formed hundreds and thousands of saints for hundreds of years. It is needed in the church. We need the Vetus Order, the traditional Latin Mass in the church. We need it because it has to be there for us to see, okay, look, we have to be at peace with the Vetus Order, and it has to inform, it has to mold how we worship. But we can't cast out in the sacraments of the church because of the abuses in one diocese, and we can't just to grow our own cause and divide the church. That's sad, because there are some amazing priests that will say the new mass. They'll do it very reverently, and they'll make sure that the form and matter is used, and and we are going to go and, as bloggers, cast out in the lives of the faithful that goes to those masses. That's wrong, guys. That's wrong. We have to build up the church. We have to build, we have to catechize, we have to build, we have to help, mentor, and not divide. The church will look at these issues and put measures in place and stipulate who are the suppliers, where you're supposed to get, and the church has made numerous clarifications on what wine and bread has to be used for mass numerous times. And bishops know this, and many bishops will only stipulate certain suppliers from which parishes can get their sacramental wine and bread. It'll just be say, you get your hosts from this convent, this Carmelite convent in our diocese. That's the only convent we're getting our hosts from. And you'll get your wine from this supplier, which is the same supplier that the Vatican uses, the same supplier that Pope Pius X used for his wine mass, or something like this. Very simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Anyway, I just wanted to give this assurance to Catholics, especially around Ireland, that might think, just because these abuses happened in one diocese in America doesn't mean that they happened in Ireland. And I've been in so many churches and sacristies, and and I've only ever seen, personally, and I've prepared a lot of masses. I've only ever seen ecclesiastical mass wine used for mass. It's practically tastes the same all around the world. It's that's the only type of wine that I've seen, and it's there's a lot of places that take a lot of care in that aspect. Anyway, God bless you. Take care. Bye bye.